Have you ever watched a true crime series and found yourself wondering what really happened, what parts of the story were real, and who were the people behind the headlines? In today's video, we're diving deep into the world of TV series and films that are based on real-life criminal cases. But don't worry, I won't spoil any endings. Instead, I'll walk you through each story, giving you a glimpse into both the show and the true events that inspired it. We'll look at the real individuals involved, explore the psychology behind their actions, and reflect on how these stories were brought to life on screen. And yes, for the sake of YouTube, we'll be avoiding certain sensitive words, but that won't stop us from exploring the tension, the mystery, and the human drama at the heart of these unforgettable cases. So grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's begin with one of the most psychologically intense series ever made, Mindhunter. This isn't just a show about chasing suspects or solving crimes. It's about the birth of an idea, a radical shift in how investigators began to understand human behavior in the darkest corners of society. The series takes us back to the late 1970s, inside the walls of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. At that time, the idea of studying the minds of violent offenders was considered strange, even dangerous. Law enforcement relied almost entirely on physical evidence and witness statements. But two agents, Holden Ford and Bill Tench, inspired by real-life figures John Douglas and Robert Ressler, believed there was something more beneath the surface, something worth understanding. And so, they did something no one else had dared to do. They sat down with people who had already been convicted, not to punish them, not to negotiate, but to talk, to ask why, to listen. These interviews are the heart of Mindhunter, and here's where the show becomes truly haunting, because many of the conversations you see on screen are drawn directly from real FBI transcripts. Word for word, the people they interview are not fictional characters. They're based on real individuals. One, for example, was known for targeting young women and described in chilling detail how he planned everything down to the smallest action. Another lived with his mother and developed a deep resentment that spiraled into unimaginable acts. And while their names are spoken in the show, I'll avoid repeating them here, not because we're afraid to say them, but because the story isn't about giving infamy. It's about understanding motive. What's striking is how normal many of these people seem. Calm, polite, reflective, and that's part of what the agents struggle with. How can someone so articulate, so seemingly in control, be capable of such horrifying behavior? Holden Ford, the young, idealistic agent, finds himself increasingly drawn into their world, fascinated, disturbed, and sometimes even manipulated. Bill Tench, his older partner, is more grounded, but he too begins to feel the emotional weight of the work. You see how their relationships, their sense of purpose, even their identity begins to shift as they face the darkest aspects of human nature. And then there's Dr. Wendy Carr, based on the real psychologist Dr. N. Walbert Burgess, who brings academic rigor to their fieldwork. She helps shape their interviews into data, patterns, the beginnings of what we now call a criminal profile. But this isn't just a show about innovation, it's about resistance. The FBI, still rooted in tradition, doesn't quite know what to make of this new method. Supervisors question their techniques, colleagues mock their efforts, and yet, quietly and persistently, they continue because they believe, and we, as viewers, begin to believe that understanding the why might be the key to stopping the who. Every episode is a slow build, full of psychological tension, shifting loyalties, and difficult questions. There's very little sensationalism here. The violence is implied rather than shown. The horror is in the detail, in the pause between questions, in the eyes of the person answering. And perhaps most unsettling of all, many of the patterns these agents uncovered are still used in investigations today. This isn't history. This is the beginning of the methods still used by law enforcement around the world. So if you're looking for something intelligent, grounded in real events, and more about the mind than the act, Mindhunter will pull you in and stay with you long after the final episode. Let's now turn to another masterpiece by the same director, David Fincher. A film not about justice, but about obsession, about a case that, to this day, has never been fully closed. This is Zodiac. Directed by David Fincher, Zodiac is more than just a true crime film. It's a portrait of obsession, a slow, meticulous journey through one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. The film is set in San Francisco during the late 1960s and early the 70s, a time of cultural change, political unrest, and fear. A string of violent acts shocked the public, and then the letters began to arrive, cryptic, taunting, sometimes including details that only the person responsible could have known. These messages were signed with a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and came from someone who claimed responsibility for the acts. The press called him the Zodiac. What made this case so haunting wasn't just the events themselves, but the way the perpetrator communicated. He sent coded letters to newspapers, messages made from symbols that no one could understand, and he demanded they be published or else. Zodiac the film focuses on three men: Robert Gray Smith, a cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle; Paul Avery, a crime reporter; and David Toshi, a police inspector. Each becomes entangled in the case in different ways. Gray Smith, in particular, finds himself drawn deeper and deeper into the mystery, long after others have moved on. And this is where the film becomes something more than a crime drama. It becomes a study of obsession. We watch as Gray Smith loses sleep, ruins relationships, and risks everything to chase a truth that constantly slips just out of reach. The closer he gets, the further it seems. Has not a detective, has not a journalist, has just curious, and that curiosity becomes a need to understand, to find meaning in the chaos, and all of it, is based on real events. Robert Gray Smith is a real person. He wrote the book the film is based on. David Toshi was a real inspector. He inspired characters in other films too, including Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. Paul Avery, the reporter, was also real, and he received threats himself. The Zodiac case, to this day, remains technically unsolved. There were suspects, there was evidence, but never enough to officially close the case. And the letters, with their strange symbols and eerie stopped as suddenly as they began. What Zodiac does so brilliantly is capture that atmosphere. The growing tension, the frustration of law enforcement, the fear in the city, and the question that lingers over every scene: will they ever find out who it was? This is a film that respects the intelligence of the viewer. It doesn't rely on shock or spectacle. It relies on facts, timelines, and the human toll of uncertainty. If you've ever stared too long at a puzzle, tried to piece together something that doesn't quite fit, or felt haunted by an unanswered question, Zodiac will feel all too familiar. Let's now step back in time even further to another story of fear, reform, and innovation, but this time set in the gaslit streets of 19th century New York. Let's talk about The Alienist. Next, we travel back in time to a city on the edge of transformation. The year is 1896. The place, New York City. Industrial progress is reshaping the skyline. Horse-drawn carriages still clatter over cobblestone streets. Electric lights are flickering into life, and deep within the shadows of this new metropolis, something sinister is stirring. The Alienist is a psychological period drama that blends historical fact with fictional storytelling. But its roots, its methods, and its atmosphere are all deeply grounded in reality. The story begins when a series of disturbing crimes rocks the city. The victims are vulnerable, overlooked by society, and the crimes are not random. They follow a pattern, one that traditional police work struggles to see, let alone understand. Enter Dr. Laszlo Kreisler, the man referred to as an alienist. In those days, alienist was the term used for what we now call a forensic psychologist. The belief was that people with mental disorders were alienated from their true nature, and it was the alienist's role to bring them back into balance. Kreisler, portrayed with quiet intensity in the series, believes that to understand a person's actions, we must first understand their mind, their past, their trauma. He teams up with Sarah Howard, the first woman to work in a clerical position at the NYPD, who's pushing against the boundaries of her time, and with John Moore, a newspaper illustrator with a journalist's instinct and a troubled past of his own. Together, this unlikely trio begins to investigate using tools that were revolutionary at the time: psychological profiling, early forensic evidence, and an understanding of childhood development and mental illness. While the case they pursue in the series is fictional, the backdrop is startlingly real. Teddy Roosevelt, yes, that Teddy Roosevelt, was the actual police commissioner of New York in 1896, and has portrayed in the show as someone genuinely committed to reforming a deeply corrupt and inefficient police department. Roosevelt's drive for change in law enforcement was instrumental in shaping modern investigative practices, and the crimes depicted in the series, while invented for the story, mirror real unsolved horrors from that time, particularly in how certain groups of people were left unprotected, and how early psychology was only just beginning to offer explanations for extreme behavior. What The Alienist does so well is immerse you in this world. You can almost feel the cold fog rolling in from the East River. You see the opulence of high society set against the desperation of the slums. You feel the tension of a city where justice was often more about reputation than truth. It also reminds us that the science we take for granted today, fingerprinting, behavioral analysis, criminal profiling, all began somewhere, with people like Kreisler, with questions no one had asked before. And that's what makes The Alienist so compelling. It's not about fast answers or modern technology. It's about instinct, psychology, and the courage to look beyond what's visible. It's a haunting, thoughtful series that mixes rich period detail with very real questions. What makes someone capable of harming others? How do early experiences shape a life? And what happens when society refuses to see the signs? Let's now step forward into the 1970s once again, but this time we'll view events through the eyes of someone who never saw it coming. A woman who lived beside a charming man, only to discover he wasn't who he claimed to be. Let's talk about extremely wicked, shockingly evil and vile. Some stories are told from the outside, from the perspective of the investigators, the press, or the public watching from a distance. But this next story is different. Extremely wicked, shockingly evil and vile invites us to see events from the inside, from the point of view of someone who loved the wrong person and didn't realize it until it was far too late. The film is based on the memoir of Elizabeth Candle, the longtime girlfriend of one of the most notorious criminals in American history. But it isn't a typical true crime narrative. It's not built around what he did. It's about how she saw him, who she thought he was. Zac Efron plays the man at the center of it all, and his performance is deliberately disarming. As charming, intelligent, confident, the kind of person you'd trust without question. And that's the point. That's what makes it terrifying. Elizabeth, played with quiet strength and confusion by Lily Collins, is a single mother. She meets him at a bar. They fall in love. Has kind to her daughter. He helps around the house. He supports her. And when strange news reports begin to surface about someone out there committing violent acts, she refuses to believe it could be him. And who could blame her? He didn't match the image of someone capable of harm. He was calm, funny, soft-spoken. Her friends liked him. He made breakfast. He said he loved her, and yet, slowly she begins to doubt. Tiny things begin to pile up. Phone calls, late nights, news reports, and then the arrests. But still, she clings to what she believes is true, that the man she shares her home with is being unfairly accused. That this is all a mistake. The film never shows the acts themselves. It doesn't need to. It focuses instead on denial, trust, and how a person's mind can shield itself from the unbearable. It's a quiet kind of horror, not the horror of violence, but the horror of betrayal, of knowing someone deeply, only to discover you didn't know them at all. What makes this story even more unsettling is that it's all real. The names, the places, the interviews, the trial, all of it happened. Elizabeth's memoir, The Phantom Prince, was written years later as a way of making sense of her past, and through her eyes, we experience a uniquely personal angle, the angle of someone who was not a victim of direct violence, but of emotional manipulation. Someone whose entire reality was slowly dismantled by the truth. The film also explores how the public reacted, how charisma can blind a courtroom, how television audiences can turn a trial into a spectacle, and how dangerous charm can be when it hides something dark beneath the surface. If Mindhunter shows us how investigators try to understand a person's actions from the outside, Extremely Wicked shows us how easy it is to miss the truth when you're standing right beside it. It's not a story of justice or crime solving. It's a story of awakening, of looking back and realizing how far from the truth you were, even while living in it. Up next, we move from dramatic fiction into the realm of raw, unscripted storytelling. A documentary that captured the world's attention, not because of what was shown, but because of what it suggested. Let's talk about Making a Murderer. If the previous stories felt like psychological thrillers, this one feels more like a long, slow unfolding of a real-life mystery, one that sparked debates in living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms across the world. Making a Murderer is a Netflix documentary series that follows a man named Stephen Avery from Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. But this isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a story about systems, how they function, how they fail, and what happens when one individual becomes trapped inside them. The first thing you need to know is that Stephen Avery was once wrongfully convicted. In 1985, he was sent to prison for a serious crime, and he served 18 years before DNA evidence proved he didn't do it. He was released, and his case became a symbol of wrongful convictions and the need for reform in the American justice system. But then, just a few years later, while he was suing the county over that wrongful conviction, he was arrested again. This time, for a different and deeply disturbing case. That's where Making a Murderer begins. What makes this series so gripping isn't just the events themselves, but the way they unfold. You see raw footage from the time, you hear from Avery's family, from his lawyers, from law enforcement. You watch courtroom proceedings, listen to recorded phone calls, and slowly begin to form your own opinion. And it's not just about Stephen Avery. The story also involves his teenage nephew, who was pulled into the case under deeply controversial circumstances. His taped confession, the way he was questioned, and his role in the trial became major points of debate. Was he telling the truth? Was he coerced? The series doesn't tell you what to believe. It simply lays it out, piece by piece. What sets Making a Murderer apart is how it reveals the machinery of the legal system. You see how evidence is collected, how it's interpreted, and, sometimes, how it's used to fit a narrative. You begin to ask, is justice always objective? Can a community truly be impartial when its own institutions are under fire? The series also shows us the emotional toll on families, not just the accused, but their parents, siblings, and neighbors, people whose lives are completely reshaped by media attention, by community judgment, and by the slow, grinding weight of the court process. When the first season of Making a Murderer was released, it became a cultural phenomenon. Viewers weren't just watching, they were investigating. Online forums exploded with theories, timelines, and debates. Petition campaigns were launched. Legal experts weighed in, and for many people, it became more than just a show. It became a cause. But here's the thing, the series doesn't give you a clear resolution. Just like in real life, the truth can be messy. There are contradictions, moments of doubt, gaps in the record. And that's what makes it so powerful. It reminds us that justice is not always black and white. Whether or not you believe Stephen Avery is innocent or guilty isn't really the point. What Making a Murderer asks is bigger. How much do we trust our systems? How do we hold them accountable? And what happens when the story you're told doesn't quite add up? It's a slow burn, emotional, frustrating, sometimes heartbreaking, but always grounded in the real words, the real documents, and the real people at the center of the storm. Let's now turn to another Netflix series, one that gives voice not to the lawyers or the public, but to the man himself. A voice that, for many, is deeply unsettling. This is Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes. Some stories hit hardest not because of what's shown, but because of what's heard. Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes is not a drama. It's not a reenactment. It's a documentary built around the real voice of one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. And hearing that voice is an experience like no other. Bundy, whose name has become widely known, was interviewed extensively during his time in prison. He was articulate, intelligent, and chillingly calm. What you hear in the tapes is not rage, not regret, but control. Calculation, a man who seemed to enjoy not just what he had done, but the idea that people would be trying to understand him. The series begins with those interviews, tapes recorded by journalists hoping to unlock the truth. But Bundy didn't give it up easily. He spoke in riddles, in theories, sometimes in the third person, as if he were describing someone else. And in doing so, he told us more than he intended. Alongside these recordings, the series presents archival footage, news reports, courtroom scenes, family photos, public reactions. We watch as the nation's perception of him shifted, from disbelief to fascination to horror. And it's that public perception that makes this case especially disturbing. Because Bundy didn't look the part, he didn't fit the stereotype of someone capable of extreme acts. He was well-dressed, educated, confident. He smiled in court, joked with reporters. He had studied law, and even chose to represent himself during trial. And people, especially the media, couldn't seem to look away. Some were even drawn to him. The tension between how he presented himself and what he was accused of is what makes the Ted Bundy tapes so unnerving. It forces us to question our assumptions, to confront the uncomfortable truth that appearances can be deceiving, and that charisma can be a mask. The documentary doesn't dwell on graphic detail. It doesn't have to. The audio alone carries enough weight. You listen as he circles around the truth. As journalists grow more frustrated, as timelines come into focus, as patterns emerge, the tension builds not from what's shown, but from what's implied. And what's truly haunting is that much of this happened in plain sight. Bundy crossed state lines, escaped custody twice, appeared on national news, and for years he remained a mystery not just to the public, but to the very people trying to stop him. Conversations with a killer is a reminder that real evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it speaks softly, it smiles, it blends in. It also shows us the danger of mythologizing criminals, of turning real pain into spectacle. Because while Bundy spoke freely on tape, those who suffered often had no voice at all. This series gives us a rare opportunity to listen, not just to the man himself, but to the way society responded to him and what that says about all of us. If you're looking for something more grounded in raw reality than scripted drama, this one is hard to forget. Not because of what you see, but because of what you hear and what it leaves behind. Now, let's move to a very different kind of story, one that focuses not on the person responsible, but on those who weren't believed. A case where justice was nearly lost, not because of lack of evidence, but because of a lack of trust. Let's talk about Unbelievable. Some stories are hard to hear, not because they're violent or shocking, but because they reveal something uncomfortable about the systems we trust to protect us. Unbelievable is one of those stories. This limited series, based on true events, begins with a young woman named Marie. She reports an assault. She tells the truth, or at least she tries to. But instead of being supported, she's questioned, doubted, pressured to change her statement. Eventually, under that pressure, she does. What follows is not just the unraveling of a case, but the unraveling of a person. Marie becomes isolated, discredited, and the people around her, family, police, the system, begin to treat her not as a victim, but as a problem. The first half of Unbelievable is painful to watch because it's quiet, subtle. There's no dramatic music, no chase scenes, just awkward silences. Hesitant answers, a young woman trying to make sense of a world that has stopped listening to her. And then, in a completely different state, years later, another case surfaces. Then another. Patterns begin to emerge. Clues begin to connect. And this time, the investigation is led by two women, Detectives Karen Duvall and Grace Rasmussen. What makes this part of the story remarkable is how these two investigators approach their work. With empathy, with curiosity, and most importantly, with belief. They listen, they take their time, they question carefully, not forcefully. And in doing so, they begin to uncover a truth that others had missed. What's powerful about Unbelievable is that it's not just a crime story. It's a story about believing people, about how institutional bias, assumptions, and fatigue can cloud judgment, and how easily the truth can be buried when no one's willing to look deeper. Mary's story, as it turns out, is not unique. What happened to her has happened to others. The difference here is that someone finally paid attention. The series is based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning article titled An Unbelievable Story of Rape, which explored the real-life events behind the show. Every major character is based on a real person, and while the show changes some names and compresses the timeline, the core truth remains untouched. It's not easy viewing, it shouldn't be, but it's important, because it shows what can happen when people in power dismiss someone's pain. And it also shows what's possible when investigators approach their work with humility and humanity. Toni Collette and Merritt Weaver, who play the detectives bring warmth and quiet strength to their roles. They're not fleshy, they don't lecture, they just do the work, one step at a time. And by doing so, they begin to put the pieces together, not just of the case, but of a system in desperate need of reform. Unbelievable reminds us that justice isn't only about catching the person responsible. It's about how we treat people along the way. It's about listening. It's about believing. And sometimes it's about going back to the beginning, to the story no one believed, and starting again. Now, let's take a final turn in our journey, a story that comes from Australia. One of the darkest on our list, not because of what it shows, but because of how deeply it explores the psychology of influence, pressure, and silence. Let's talk about Snowtown. Some stories are so bleak, so unsettling, that even the silence between scenes feels heavy. Snowtown, also known internationally as the Snowtown Murders, is not an easy film to watch, not because of what it shows, but because of how deeply it pulls you into the environment where everything happens. The film is based on real events that took place in South Australia during the 1990s, in a working-class suburb outside of Adelaide. But it's not just about what occurred, it's about how it happened, and perhaps more importantly, why no one stopped it. At the center of the story is Jamie, a quiet, emotionally numb teenager growing up in poverty, surrounded by neglect, instability, and unspoken trauma. His home life is fractured, his community scarred by unemployment and isolation. Violence is something that sits just under the surface, invisible, but constant. Then a man named John arrives, as charismatic, confident, outspoken. At first, he seems like a savior, someone who protects the vulnerable, who speaks out against injustice, who offers strength where others offer nothing at all. But slowly, that strength becomes control, and that control turns into something much darker. What makes Snowtown so haunting is how ordinary everything feels. The streets, the kitchens, the phone calls, the silences. The people don't speak in grand monologues. They mutter, they shrug, they go quiet. The violence isn't always seen, it's felt. And what you feel most of all is fear, confusion, pressure. Jamie becomes caught in a web of influence. Has not portrayed as evil, or even especially angry, has lonely, passive, drifting towards something terrible because, in his world, no one taught him how to say no, and no one around him wanted to ask questions. The real events that inspired Snowtown involved multiple victims, some of whom were known personally to those involved. The details of the case were disturbing enough that, to this day, they remain a point of national discomfort in Australia. But the film doesn't sensationalize, it doesn't exploit. It shows how manipulation works, slowly, intimately, invisibly. How someone can step into a broken space and fill it with something far worse. And how people, especially young people, can become trapped, not by force, but by loyalty, fear, and a desperate need to belong. Shot in natural light, with non-professional actors and handheld cameras, Snowtown feels more like a documentary than a drama. The performances are raw, the pacing is slow, but beneath that stillness is a deep, pulsing tension, the kind that stays with you long after the credits roll. It's not a story of justice, it's not even a story of investigation. It's a story of silence, of what happens when an entire community looks the other way, and of how power, once given to the wrong person, can poison everything around it. Snowtown is not for everyone, but if you're drawn to true stories that explore the psychology behind action and the consequences of inaction, it may be one of the most powerful films you'll ever experience. So, what do all these stories have in common? From Mindhunter to Snowtown, these films and series aren't just about crime. They're about people, about the systems we trust, and the moments they fail, about the psychology behind extreme actions, and the quiet, sometimes painful effort it takes to understand them. Each story we've talked about today is based on real events, real people, real consequences, and yet they've been shaped into something more, not just entertainment, but reflection, a way of asking deeper questions. What drives someone to harm? What keeps others silent? And how do we begin to make sense of things that defy understanding? Some of these shows highlight brilliant investigation. Others show us systemic failure. Some center the voices of those harmed. Others reveal how easily reality can be distorted by charm, by power, by fear. None of these stories offer easy answers, and that's what makes them so important. They ask us not just to watch, but to think. If you found this video interesting, if you'd like to explore more stories like these, without spoilers and with care, I'd love for you to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, and I promise to keep the storytelling thoughtful, respectful, and deeply human. Thank you for watching. Stay curious and take care.